Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Hello, good evening. 7:30 on the dot. I think this might be the first time in my 4 years here we've started at the start time. My name is William Gilinski. I'm the Director of Programming here at JW3. A very warm welcome here. JW3 is the Jewish home of culture and conversation. If this is your first visit tonight, I hope it's the first of many. We're delighted to be partnering with the Jewish News for tonight's talk on what the Qur'an says about Jews. Oh, it got very dark suddenly. Jews, Judaism, that's maybe a little bit too dark. Be nice to see a bit more of the audience if we can, Kirill. Yeah, I think we preferred that. It was a bit more like a sort of front room. So I'll start that bit again. We're delighted to be partnering with the Jewish News. Tonight's event is called What the Qur'an Says About Jews, Judaism and the Torah, with Rick Sopher and Dr Abdulla Galadari. It's chaired by JW3's long-standing historian and regular teacher of current affairs in the Middle East, Paula Kitching. I'd also like to welcome those online. If you've got questions online, please email them to the address that was sent to you in the email this morning. At this point, please could I ask you to check that your phones are on silent or airplane mode, or do not disturb, or you could even turn them off. And now I'd like to ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Paula Kitching, who will introduce the panellists.
I will stand briefly. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on what is quite a miserable Tuesday evening, but I understand completely why you've all braved the weather conditions to be here this evening. When this first popped up into my inbox as, would I be interested in attending? I was thrilled. I said, of course, I'd love to come. I can't wait to listen to this. And then very shortly afterwards, there was a message saying, oh, good, I'm glad you are available. Which I guess is always the best way of getting somebody to do something. But I'm not at all sorry, because it is indeed the kind of event, and was the event, that I was very keen to come and listen to anyway. I was both surprised and yet not shocked to find that this is the first time in JW3's history that we've had a talk with the word Qur'an in the title. And that tells us something about the times we live in and the period of current affairs of the world around us. And that's rather unfortunate, because I think one of the things we're going to find out this evening is just how close in many ways some of the things that we think of as normal and belonging to one community are in fact possibly shared, or at least understood in different ways. And doing that explaining for us, delivering that knowledge that I think is really important for us to have in a world that seems forever at odds, are tonight's very important speakers. I'll introduce them both individually, but first of all, I'd like to welcome Rick Sopher and Abdulla Galadari, and I'm hoping he's going to be joining us on the screen. He's right there behind me. That's right. See, it's so cruel, this IT. You think you're in charge of everything, but you actually stood there. I feel I should stand back a bit now. Let me introduce them both with their rather eminent, this is the reduced bio. Can you imagine what the full one's going to look like? So Rick graduated from Christ College, Cambridge in 1981. He had a career in finance. Now, I know we're going to find a little bit about that, I hope, later on, if there is time in some of the questions. I think it's quite an important link for us to understand. He was working with Edmond de Rothschild, where he was CEO, and I think that might add something later on. In 2007, for his work in religious education, he was awarded the Chevalier de Légion d'Honneur by French President Jacques Chirac. Most recently, he is emerging as a key figure in interfaith scriptural dialogue. He is a fellow of the Wolf Institute, Cambridge, and through them, in November 2020, he convened a reading group comprising the world's leading authorities on religious texts to discuss similarities and differences between the Qur'an and the Bible. He has engaged in discussions with Muslim Imams in the UK comparing Jewish and Muslim texts, which have appeared online, and in 2025 participated in the Muslim-Jewish Accords. I'm going to ask him to explain a lot more about those later on. There will be time for questions, I should probably add, at the end of this evening, but I'm sorry to say, you're going to have to go through me. And I have a very long list. Our second speaker tonight is Abdulla Galadari, please correct me if I said that incorrectly, is an associate professor of Islamic studies at the Khalifa University and holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Aberdeen. His field is in Quranic. Now, do you know what I practice? The hermeneutics, and I'm going to get that wrong again later, and the Quran, possibly engagement with Near Eastern traditions in late antiquity, including biblical and rabbinic literature. He uses a multidisciplinary approach to the Quran that includes historical and philological methods to understand the Quran's milieu and in conversation with different audiences and traditions. Where do I begin? There is also a long list of books. I'm going to leave it at that, because do you know what? I think what we most need to do is find out exactly what they have been studying and what they can tell us, and then we can come back later to what they're doing next in book form. Could I hand over to you?
Well, thank you very much, Paula, and thank you also to William and JW3 for having us for this talk and for the courage to have a talk about the Quran and how it relates to the Bible. And thank you for coming on a terrible evening to listen to our talk. Abdullah, if it's okay, I'm going to go first and start off with my very first impressions as a place to start. What did I think when I first read the Quran? First impressions of a Jewish reader of the Quran. Well, the first thing to say is that it's incredibly interesting how many references there are to biblical characters that I knew when I was reading about Noah, that's Noah, and Ibrahim, obviously, it was Abraham of the Bible. And I was amazed that the Quran mentions Moses 136 times, way more than any other character in the Quran, under the name Musa, Moshe, in the Hebrew Bible. And I was connected also to the stories. I mean, there was Noah and the flood, Abraham and his guests, Jonah and the fish, and so on. So it immediately resonated with me, this Quranic book. And I started to think that perhaps there was something in it, that 2 billion Muslims around the world are revering and cherishing the same characters and stories that we revere when we read our own Torah. The thing that you've come to hear about isn't actually in the Quran. That is that the Quran does not call for the complete destruction of all Jewish people. Okay? We'll get Abdullah to explain more about that later. But it did contain some statements that were a bit cryptic maybe, but critical of some Jews. And we're going to ask Abdullah to unpack those for us this evening. And then once I got further into it and started reading the Quran in its proper Arabic, I started really enjoying the words in the Quran that are similar sounding to or cognate with words in the Torah, like ruh, which is ruach, meaning spirit, or iman. The Quran talks about iman, which is emunah of the Bible, meaning faith. Kudus, for holy, kadosh in Hebrew. So it immediately resonated with me, some of the words in the Bible. But there were these difficult verses, and one of them, and I wasn't really sure how to deal with them, how seriously bad they were. So let's have a look at what Abdullah and I think is probably the most offensive word toward Jews contained in the Quran, and that is the word that's contained in Surah Al-Baqarah, that chapter, which calls Jews apes. Oh, before I go on, let me just tell you about Surah Al-Baqarah. That's the second chapter of the Quran. Why is it called Baqarah? Similar to the Hebrew Bakar, meaning cow. It's the surah of the cow. Why is it called cow, by the way? Because it mentions in that second chapter the story of the red cow, the red heifer, that you might know about from the Bible. It's in there in their second chapter. Anyway, back to the subject of Jewish people being apes. Why does it call Jewish people apes because they were violators of the Sabbath. And the Quran says that those people merit a divine curse. There's the Arabic. The violators are told, Kunu kiradatan hasi'in, be you spurned apes. Just notice for a moment, it doesn't actually mention any capital or physical punishments for these so-called apes. How do you compare, how do you assess how bad that is? Well, perhaps we should compare it to the Torah account of what happened to those very same people, the people who broke the Sabbath. And here's the Torah account in the book of Numbers, 1536. A man was caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath. You may well know the story. The community, they went to Moses. Moses went to God as usual. God comes back to Moses. Moses comes to the people and said, God has said this order, Vayidgamu Torah ba'avanim vayamot. The community carried out the order given by God to Moses, and the whole community then did as they were told by Moses and by God, which was they stoned the poor man to death. So, comparison, that rather nasty phrase, calling Jewish people apes. But the chastisement of the Sabbath breaker in the Quran is clearly less severe than the Torah. That's a like-for-like comparison of the scripts. Okay. Right, Abdullah, I'm handing to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to also thank all the organizers for providing this platform and everybody there who are listening to this. Thank you very much. Any consulate, I do know, understand that the weather in London isn't as fabulous as you usually don't expect anyway. But I'm coming to you from Boston in the United States, and last week we had an accumulation of 2 feet of snow with 25 degrees below zero. So hopefully maybe the weather in London is not as bad as it was last week here in Boston. Now let me tell you about my very first impressions of the Muslim reader of the Hebrew Bible. Now, why anyways would a Muslim, you would think, even want to read the Hebrew Bible? But in reality, when you read the Quran, pretty much many of the stories do come from the Hebrew Bible. Actually, many people may not even realize, but the person who the Quran most mentions is actually Moses, who is mentioned 136 times in the whole Quran. The second person is Abraham, who is mentioned 62 times in the whole of the Quran. So basically, the Quran has a lot to say about some of the stories that we do find from the Hebrew Bible. So if you go to the next slide, to really understand the Quran very well, it may be necessary to actually understand the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible contains many different details of the stories that the Quran only very briefly alludes to. And the Quran actually says, that if you don't know about those stories, ask the people of the book. So in other words, ask the Jews and the Christians who have the Bible with them. So if you don't know the stories of those, biblical refers back to the Mishnah. To know what exists in the rabbinic tradition in the Mishnah that, if you're killing so basically, these Jewish sources appear to provide able to understand the Quran.
Thank you, Abdullah. Right. Important to me was how the Quran saw the Torah and whether it accepted that the Torah was divine revelation or whether somehow it didn't. And we come across these amazing statements in the Quran. This one, Inna anzalna al-Torah fiha huda wa nur. Indeed, we, God, revealed the Torah, understood to be the Torah, containing guidance and light. One of many statements that the Quran uses to describe the Torah. And we have sent down, here's another one, and we have sent down to you the book, that's the Quran, with the truth, confirming, using the word there, musaddiqan, confirming, like the word, can you see the word tzedek in there? Musaddiqan is tzedek, meaning it's right, confirming what is between his hands of the book, that means the Bible, and trusting it, muhaiminan, using the word muhaiminan. Now, you can discuss a lot about what that word muhaiminan means. We've used the translation trusting it. But you can see that muhaiminan might have the word amen in it. It's like an affirmation. It's like the Quran affirming the Bible, which is indeed what it does consistently through the Quran. And in our academic group that Abdullah and I participate in, that we convened at the Wolf Institute, the general approach of the academic scholars there is that the Quran never contradicts anything fundamental contained in the Bible. Here's another one. This comes at the end of chapter 12 of the Quran, which is Surah Yusuf, which is the Joseph chapter, where its last verse, it's the 111th verse of this chapter entirely about Joseph, compares to the 443 verses in the Torah about Joseph. Anyway, it gets to the end of the story, which is, it abridges, and it says there's a moral in their stories for those who understand. The Quran is not a fabricated narration, but a confirmation, there's that word musaddiqan again, of what is in the Bible. So it takes the story of Joseph, gets to the end of it, provides a few lessons, and then says it's a confirmation. And there's morals in their stories, meaning in the Bible, I think. Back to Abdullah.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. So, one of the questions that a lot of people sometimes ask is, does the Quran ask its followers not to be friends with Jews? And I understand that something of that has occurred recently in the British context. So let me actually show you the passage in the Quran which directly and specifically speaks about that. So if we go to the next slide. All right, so in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is chapter 5 of the Quran, it says, "You who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as allies. They are allies only to each other. Anyone who takes them as an ally becomes one of them." So now a lot of people would take this out of context and say, aha, so it means that, the Quran is, clear. You should not be befriending the Jews. But let's look, just a few verses later. So only 4 verses later, it explains, it says, "Your true allies are God, His messenger, the believers, those who keep up the prayer, pay the prescribed alms, and bow." So let's go to the next slide. Now, a lot of people would say, aha, so the Quran does in fact ask its followers not to be friends with Jews, right? So it's very clear, a lot of people would say. But let's actually dive a little bit deeper to what the Quran is actually saying and what it is not saying. So you see in the passage, and I've color-coded it in here so that you will be able to compare it, but it says, your true allies are God, his messenger, and the believers, those who keep up the prayer, pay the prescribed alms, and bow to God. So now, if we click on next, so can the above describe some Jews, those who you can take allies? So if we look into another passage in the Quran, it talks about the people of the book, and it says that not all of the people of the book are the same. So it says they're not all alike. There are some among the people of the book who are upright. And you could see now with the color coding, those who keep up the prayer, who are upright, who recite God's book throughout the night, prostrating. They believe in God and the last day, encourage good and forbid evil, and race with one another in doing good. They are among the righteous. They will never be denied the reward for any good they do, and God knows the pious. So here the passage in the Quran is very clear, saying, not all of the Jews and the Christians are bad, right? There are some who are pious. And by the way, even the word qa'ima, which means upright, is very similar to the Hebrew amida, because amida meaning to stand, it's the standing prayer. So in here it says that who are upright, it's like, who are performing the prayer, who recite God's book throughout the night, who are prostrating, they believe in God in the last day. So when you look into the color coding, well, when it says in the passage at the top, your true allies are God, his messenger, and the believers. And of course, some of the people of the book are amongst those believers. Those who keep up the prayer, who are upright in the next passage, pay the prescribed alms, and bow to God, or in other words, prostrating. So you could basically see that, yes, among the people of the book, whom you can take allies and therefore befriend. So let's go to the next slide. Now, the question is the Quran anti-Judaism? So does the Quran truly intend to instruct perpetual enmity with Jews and Judaism? So Rick, all to you.
Okay. Well, for this, I think you have to go to the historical context to understand what was going on when the Quran first appeared. Muhammad, who lived initially in Mecca, performed a flight to Medina in 622 CE, where he lived for the last 10 years of his life. And that provides much of the context, because in Mecca there was not a big Jewish population, but in Medina there was a very sizable Jewish population. And that influences the changing tone in the Quran's verses. And many academics have studied this, including Noldecker, who set the path for this. And they divide the Quran's verses into verses that were deemed to be revealed in Mecca and verses deemed to be revealed in Medina. And the ones in Medina contain some potentially harsher ones and seem to reflect that Muhammad comes face to face with Jewish people and has a reaction. And we can see this in the word count that we've developed here. So Jewish people are referred in the Quran by many different terms, and here are the main terms they're referred by. Banu Israel, the one at the top, is that one, is referred to a lot in the Meccan verses, kind of a conceptual type of reference to the children of Israel. But when you get to the Medinan verses, the verses revealed when he comes across the Jewish population, you can see that he's using the word Yahud for Jews much more often, and also the word Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book. That's where the expression first arose, people of the book. Not from Jewish Book Week, it was like in the Quran. People of the book, used actually meaning Jews, Christians, and some others, Sabaeans and some people that we don't really know what happened to them. But anyway, those phrases are used much more in the Medinan verses, and that's where also the Torah, gets referred to a lot. So how do we bring this all together? Well, the Quran, as we've seen, reveres the Torah very clearly. Arguably, we think, was not seeking to reject Judaism and start some kind of new religion. There's no statement in the Quran saying, this is the new religion and the old one is is done with. It does rail against some Jews, as Abdullah pointed out, for not following their own laws. And it directs criticism against rabbis and Jewish religious leaders, which to my mind points to a kind of a striving for authority over the monotheists of Medina, the Jewish population of Medina. I think we have to acknowledge as well that there are several parts of the Quran which does require its audience to obey Muhammad. The Quran says if you obey Muhammad, you're obeying God. So it does require its audience to obey Muhammad, which was likely a point of conflict with, certainly with Jewish authorities. But I think the key point, to answer the way that Abdullah set up this up, is that the Quran does not require perpetual enmity against Jews or against Judaism. Abdullah.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. But a lot of people will ask, but the Quran asks its followers to fight the Jews until they pay the jizya, or the poll tax, which is some kind of a tribute for their protection. Well, let's look into the passage in the Quran which says that. It says, fight those of the people of the book who do not believe in God and the last day, who do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, who do not obey the rule of justice until they pay the tax or the jizya, belittled or humbled. So this is the passage that a lot of people would say, but it's very clear. The Quran says, fight them until they pay. So there you go. Well, again, let's dive a little bit deeper. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let us read this verse very closely. It says, fight those of the people of the book who do not believe in God on the last day. So that's one condition. Second condition, who do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden. And then third condition, who do not obey the rule of justice until they pay the tax, belittled. So there are three conditions in there that are very clear. It's not just fight the people of the book in general until they pay the tax. No, there are three specific and particular conditions. You fight those who do not believe in God on the last day. You fight those who do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden. You fight those who do not obey the rule of justice. But in other words, if those conditions don't exist, if there is, for example, a Jew who is, for example, obeying the rule of justice, a Jew who is basically upholding the Torah, then that means that that Jew, you cannot be asking them to pay the tax or the jizya. So in reality, there are three specific, very particular conditions for that rule to even apply. So the rule of paying the tax is not universal for all Jews or all Christians or all of the people of the book, but are very, very specific to those three conditions. It's only against those who do not believe in God on the last day, and those who do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, and those who do not obey the rule of justice. So going to the next slide. So the Quran basically is very specific with explicit conditions. And it is not truly general to all Jews or to all of the people of the book. So to you, Rick.
Thanks, Abdullah, for explaining that. And that perhaps explains how this verse seems to have been used for most of history. So Quran 9:29, this one that starts with fight, actually most of the time in history has been used as a protection of Jewish people and not as a way of attacking Jewish people. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take one example of the many I could give. So we're in the 1500s. After 1492, many Jewish people were fleeing from Christian Europe. And where did they go? The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, let's take one example, Constantinople. A population relatively small at the time. There's a massive Jewish influx, maybe 40,000 people. It's like 40% of the then population of Constantinople. So the people of Constantinople who were there before, Muslims, had their sort of what I call a kind of Brexit moment. They say, look, what are all these people coming in? Surely we should limit them, whatever. And there's an argument, and they say, I could just imagine it. They say, but they're very useful. They brought the printing press, and they're educated, and they contribute, and so on. And other people say, yeah, but they're not like us. Why should we have them over here? So they go to Sultan Mehmet III, who was the Sultan at the time. And I can just imagine him going to his desk and picking up the Quran and saying, well, what does the Quran have to say about this? And he lands on Quran 929. And he issues a firman in 1602, the words of which are pretty much the same as verse 929. He says, the Quran commands the protection of Jews and Christians. Their protection is a religious and communal duty for Muslims. And as long as they pay the required tax, no one should interfere with their lives or business, and preventing their peaceful living would be a violation of Islamic law. And I could give you other examples in Isfahan, in Yemen, where the same kind of thing happened. There was, do we really want these Jewish people with us? They go to the ruler reaches for his book and invokes chapter 929 to provide this special protection for Jewish people living in Muslim lands. Abdullah.
Thank you so much, Rick. So how does the Quran compare with the Hebrew Bible when addressing the children of Israel? So let's look. The Torah warns and criticizes Jews. And this is just a simple example here. Like it says, like in the book of Leviticus, if you walk in my ways, I will give you, this is what I will do. But if you do not listen, right? And then it gives examples of 51 curses. It says, I will appoint over you terror, consumption, and fever. You will sow your seed in vain, and your enemies shall eat it. You will be slain before your enemies. You will flee, and so forth. So you could basically see that, there's lots of criticism and admonishment against, the Israelites, just to make sure that they would pretty much listen to what God asks them to do. Well, if you go to the next slide, let's compare the Quran and see how it goes. The Quran, for example, says, concerning the children of Israel, but because of their breaking of their covenant, we cursed them and made their hearts hard. But then if we look into the Hebrew Bible, we see something very similar. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken the covenant I made with their ancestors. So the breaking of the covenant and the curses that come upon the Israelites because of doing so. The Quran says, for example, a party of them, concerning some of the Jews. So a party of them used to hear the words of God, then distort them after they had understood them. And when we look again also in the book of Jeremiah, how can you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us? But behold, the lying pen of the scribe has made it into a lie. So again in here, there's this accusation of distortion as well. When we look into the Quran, for example, it says, you will find them, the children of Israel, the greediest of all people for life, even more than the polytheists. And then, for example, in the Tanakh as well, we see that the Israelites' leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, and her prophets divine for money. So we see a lot of similar kinds of accusations between the Quran and the Hebrew Bible. So the thing is, if we go to the next slide, the Torah and the Hebrew prophets truly criticize the Israelites, actually far more harshly than the Quran. Because when we look into the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, in the whole of the Tanakh, how the Hebrew prophets were always admonishing the Israelites for not listening to them or for not obeying the commandments, and how they are being dealt very harshly by the biblical prophets. The Quran actually, in comparison, is very mellow. It's not as harsh as it is in the Hebrew Bible. Actually, the question is there a text more anti-Jewish than the Hebrew Bible itself? Because if you think about it, if the Hebrew Bible was not written by the Hebrews, you would say, oh, I mean, this is the most anti-Semitic book that we've ever seen. But we never call the Hebrew Bible anti-Jewish. Why? Why do we never do it? Well, because it is written as an insider. It's the people criticizing themselves, if you like, right? It's written as an insider, not as someone from the outside talking about them. So even when it contains anger and curses, it also contains a path to forgiveness and reconciliation. But the same can also be said with the Quran. Actually, the Quran here, for example, in this passage, which is, by the way, in the same chapter 5, which talks about, whether you can befriend the Jews and Christians or not. It's the same passage, same chapter. And in this passage in here, it says, and had they observed the Torah, so if they had observed God's commandments and what has been revealed to them from their Lord, they would have been overwhelmed with provisions from above and below. Some among them are upright, yet many do nothing but evil. So yes, so the same path to forgiveness and reconciliation that we see in the Hebrew Bible, we also see in the Quran. So back to you, Rick.
Thank you. Now, Abdullah's explained, and I've tried to, that the Quran contains many biblical messages. But then why don't Muslims generally read the Bible today? I've been around loads of mosques now and hardly ever see a Torah or a Bible on the bookshelves. And the answer has to do with this concept of that the Jews have falsified the Torah in some way. And that word that they use for this is yuharifun. It does appear in the Quran, for example, here. Some of them, the Jews, used to hear the words of God and then yuharifun them after they understood them. So what is yuharifun, or the noun form tahrif? Well, this was discussed for hundreds and hundreds of years by Islamic scholars, and we'll try and unpack what they made of this word yuharifun. Well, the debate centered basically around two different interpretations of the word yuharifun. It could either mean what came to be known as tahrif al-ma'na, changing the meanings of the words or taking them out of context. So they didn't say the words were wrong, they just said, you've misunderstood it, it's not like that, or we just don't like what you're saying about this verse. A bit like maybe you come out of synagogue, you say, I didn't like the rabbi's sermon, I've got a totally different opinion about that particular parasha. Or changing the words themselves, tahrif al-lafaz. Well, let's look at the timeline of how this debate evolved. This is quite interesting because in yellow over there's Prophet Muhammad dying in 632. And for the first several hundred years, the dominant view amongst the Islamic scholars was that yuharifun meant misinterpretation of the Torah. It meant that the Jews had misinterpreted it. The words were correct, but they just got the wrong idea. But starting in 1074 with Ibn Hazm, and later with more serious scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir in the 1300s, the dominant view came to be interpreted that yuharifun meant that the Jews had literally altered the Torah. Maybe they changed the words or done something with it or changed the order or something. And this was pretty impactful because, as I'm sure you know, if you ask most Muslims today on the street, when Abraham went to sacrifice his son, a story which is in the Quran, who did he sacrifice? They would tell you Ishmael, right? They'd say Ishmael. And we Jewish would obviously say Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, because that's what it says very specifically in the Torah. Well, the issue is that the Quran never actually said clearly which son it was. When Abraham addresses his son and says, come on, we're going up the mountain, he just says, Ya bunai, oh my son, come with me, we'll go up the mountain. It never actually says who the son is, never identifies him. So this is interesting. In the period where yuharifun meant to Islamic scholars that there was misinterpretation of the Torah, they thought the dominant view was that it was Isaac who was intended to be sacrificed. Well, of course it was Isaac, because that's what the Torah said. And the Quran says that the Torah contained the truth, and that's what, therefore, they believed. But once you start believing that Yuharifun meant literal alteration of the Torah, then you can say, well, it was Ishmael, and by the way, the intended sacrifice, took place in the Mecca region and not in the Jerusalem or Syria region. And that is basically what happened, and why a common view in Islam today is that they wouldn't read the Torah because they didn't need to, because it had been falsified, and anyway, they have their own Qur'an. Now, that was a kind of conventional view of the views in Islam about Yuharifun, but Abdullah, who is very scholarly, has a deeper dive on this subject.
Thank you so much, Rick. Okay, so let's actually look into one of these passages in the Quran which talks about Yuharifun, or changing, because as Rick just showed you, the conventional idea is that they have either changed the text or the meaning. But let's really look very closely into what the text actually says. The passage in here, for example, says, "O messenger, do not be grieved by those who race to surpass one another in disbelief, and the Jews who listen eagerly to lies, and to those who have not even met you, who yuharrifun," and I'm just putting these words in there. I'm not going to suggest it means even changing. I'm just going to put it as it is, as yuharrifun words, and say, if you are given this ruling, accept it, but if you are not, then beware. Well, what's interesting is that just a couple of verses later, it says, "But why do they come to you for judgment when they have the Torah with God's judgment, and even then still turn away?" It's quite interesting, where in one of the passages, it says it accuses some of the Jews to do this tahrif, to yuharrifun, to do this kind of tahrif. But then immediately after, it says, but hey, I mean, why do they come to you for judgment when they have the Torah with God's judgment? So if they have changed the text, it wouldn't make any sense that just two verses later it says, they already have the Torah. Why are they even coming to you, Muhammad, right? What's interesting is that even when we open the books of tafsir, the commentaries, the Muslim traditional commentary concerning this specific passage in the Quran, none of the commentaries suggest that the Jews either changed the text or even changed the meaning of the Torah. They suggest that the circumstances, they say, is that what happened in here is that one of the Jews in the time of Muhammad committed adultery. And so the Jewish community wanted to seek Muhammad's judgment against that adulterer. And so when they went to Muhammad, Muhammad said, well, bring in the Torah. What does the Torah say about, what does it say about adultery? And then, according to the traditional Muslim commentaries, they're saying that when the Jews came with the Torah, some of the Jews were physically trying to hide with their hands the passage in the Torah concerning the stoning verse, or the punishment for adultery. And then Muhammad says, what's below your hands, and then it's the stoning verse. So in Muslim traditional commentaries concerning this particular verse, none of them suggest that the Jews in the time of Muhammad either changed the Torah's text or even changed the meaning of the Torah. All they did is that they didn't really want to actually abide by what the Torah says. So that is why perhaps, just two verses after it says yuharrifun, it says, and why do they come to you for judgment when they have the Torah with God's judgment? Well, let's look into the next slide. Just a few passages later, it actually says what Rick earlier told you about, that the Quran is actually saying that we sent to you the book with truth, confirming musaddiq, right? That which is between your hands, and muhaymin, and trusting it. And then the next verse says, a few verses later it says, if they had upheld the Torah and the gospel, and it uses the word aqamu, which means to uphold, the Torah and the gospel, and what was sent down to them from their Lord, they would have been given abundance from above and from below. If you look into the a couple of verses later as well, so on the next click, it says, say, people of the book, you have no basis unless you uphold the Torah and the gospel. Now, what's interesting in here is that those two passages uses the word aqamu or tuqimu, which comes from qiyam, very similar to the Hebrew word to straighten or to uphold. And when we look into it, so if you look into the next slide, the word yuharrifun comes from the Arabic root harafa, and the same root harafa, we actually have the word inhiraf in Arabic, which means to stray away. And the word tuqimu is from the Arabic istiqama, which means, to uphold, to be straight. And so we actually see that they're exact opposites of each other. Those two words are exact opposites of each other. So it is as if the Quran is actually saying, do not do yuharrifun, do not do the tahrif, don't become, stray away from the commandments in the Torah. Instead, you should be tuqimu, you should be upholding the commandments in the Torah. So that is what the Quran is actually saying in here. It's not suggesting that the Jews either changed the text of the Torah, nor even changed the meaning of the Torah, but simply that they did not want to uphold the commandments, which, by the way, again, is an accusation that you will find in all of the biblical prophets in the Tanakh, saying the same kinds of accusations against some of the Israelites as well, and asking them to obey the commandments. So let's look into the conclusions. What does the Quran really then want? Well, the Quran wants the Jews to be better Jews. Otherwise it wouldn't have said, oh, people of the book, you have no basis unless you uphold the Torah and the gospel. So it wants them to be better Jews. It wants them to adhere to Judaism. And it wants them to follow the Torah and the Bible. So that is what the Quran truly wants. To you, Rick.
No, you're going to do that one, I think.
Okay. So the Quran wants what the biblical prophets actually want, no differently. Yes, it does admonish the Jewish people, very much like the biblical prophets. And it does even praise them, very much like the biblical prophets also sometimes do. But also differently, by the way, the admonishments of the Quran is less harsh and less forceful than what you actually see in the Tanakh itself. So there isn't really much of a big difference. So this passage that you actually see now, it says, say, O people of the book, come to terms common between us and you, that we worship none but God, and that we associate nothing with him, and that none of us takes others as lords besides God. So here, basically, you see that the Quran is actually saying, well, let's come to a common word between us. And this is what we will agree. It doesn't say that Jews, you must become Muslims or you have to follow the Quran necessarily, right? It says, no, let's come to some common word, that we worship none but God, we associate nothing with him, and that none of us take others as lords besides God. So we would only have God as our Lord.
Right, good. Very good.
To you, Rick.
I would have done that one, but we have a common understanding on the terms common between us and you anyway. I just like this, and we're wrapping up now, but I just like to, there's obviously a question, why did God create different peoples and tribes? And the Quran gives an answer which I really like. Ya ayyuha nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa antha. O people, we created you from a male and a female. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا, and we made you races and tribes لِتَعْرَفُوا, so that you may know one another. And many Islamic commentators say, so that you may know one another in good terms. It's clearly a good terms verse. I really quite like that one. Abdullah, you for one slide.
Well, thank you, Rick. And also, in the Quran, if we read it carefully, there is no need to actually carry from the Quran any kind of anti-Jewish sentiment. There is no anti-Jewish sentiment. By the way, just as the Quran admonishes Jews, or some of the Jews, it also admonishes some of Muhammad's own followers. It calls some of his own followers hypocrites. So it's not, something we have to recognize that it's not something specific to his people, but even Muhammad's own followers have been heavily criticized and even cursed in the Quran as well. But does that mean that the Quran is anti-Muslim or anti-followers of Muhammad? Of course not. And the same thing, therefore, it doesn't carry this anti-Jewish sentiment either. To you, Rick.
Thank you very, very much, Abdullah. My final word is that, people talk a lot now these days about Islamophobia. Maybe a part of Islamophobia is maybe Quranophobia, a fear of what the Quran contains. Is it a war manual? What is it? I hope we've tried to show this evening our conclusion that I think there's no need for Quranophobia. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I don't know about everybody else. I'm feeling both educated, enlightened, and ever so slightly told off. That was absolutely fascinating. I will open it up for questions. Before we dive into the questions from you all and for some of you online, we were aware that there were some things that we probably wanted to draw out a little bit more. We sort of faced these head on. We've talked, as I say, I feel very sort of enriched from that, and it's made me contemplate things quite considerably. But we know that people do quote the Quran in a way that is often in aggression and anger, and we've seen it recently in conjunction with current affairs and what is happening in Israel right now and in the Palestinian territories. What does the Quran say about the Holy Land or about Israel? Does it say anything specific?
Okay. Well, let me try that, Abdullah, if that's okay. And we'll divide it maybe into the Holy Land and then maybe Jerusalem, which is a separate topic. Maybe you do Jerusalem, but let me start with Holy Land. Shall we do that?
Let's start.
Okay. The Quran is really pretty clear about what should happen in Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, the Holy Land. One statement it makes, which is pretty much backed up in other places in the Quran. Ya qawmi, O my people, it says to the people of the book, to the Jews. Udhul al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, enter the Holy Land. Ilati kataba alla lakum, that God has kataba, like written for you or ordained for you, and do not turn back and become losers. There it's wrapped in a story about the emissaries that were sent to spy out the land of Canaan, and it actually says go and then at other places it says and reside in the land, using the word sakin, go and reside in the land, it tells the children of Israel. There is no counterclaim in the Quran at all. It doesn't say that the Torah was wrong when it said that the Israelites should occupy the land. So I think it's pretty clear about what the Quran thinks should happen in the Holy Land. The Israelites should go in there. Can I just add one thing? Which is that if you look in Hebrew scripture is extremely clear that the Israelites are not to occupy the land and be in the land exclusively. Indeed, there are all these statements about how the ger, the foreigner residing with you, the ezrach, has rights and should live alongside you, and that's clearly understood. So if anyone would tell me, we Jewish people have this land exclusively, it's totally unbiblical.
Thank you. And Jerusalem, what about that one, Abdullah?
Well, thank you. Well, the name Jerusalem, by the way, is not mentioned anywhere in the Quran itself. So the Holy Land is perhaps the only kind of mention of a place that is obviously holy. But the word Jerusalem itself is never really mentioned. And if we think about it, nowhere, whether in the Quran or even in the tradition of the Prophet himself, Muhammad, nowhere does he even say, for example, let's all the Muslims, let's go and go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was actually only conquered by the Muslims after the death of Muhammad. He never himself asked, to go there. And when it was conquered, it was not conquered from the Jews. It was conquered from the Byzantines at the time. So there was this war between the Muslims and the Byzantines. And even in that context, even when the Muslims actually conquered Jerusalem, according to the Muslim tradition, when the Muslim Caliph entered Jerusalem, he was asked by the Patriarch of Jerusalem at the time, the Christian Patriarch of Jerusalem, to basically pray in the cathedral, which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we today also find in Jerusalem. And the Muslim Caliph said, no, I'm afraid if I pray here that the Muslims later on will claim it to be a mosque. And so he prayed outside of the church. And that is why today, outside of the church, you see a mosque called the Masjid Umar, or the Mosque of Umar, because the name of the Caliph at the time was Umar. And he prayed there. He never even said, well, let's go to, for example, the Masjid al-Aqsa, or the Temple Mount. That's not the place where he considered is, the place that he should be going to pray in Jerusalem. He simply just prayed outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it's very interesting is that what we see centuries later of Muslim tradition is very different than what the Quran says, or what even the Muhammad's traditions and sayings have said, or even the earliest of the Muslim traditions have said. So Jerusalem itself has become perhaps more of a political thing that came up later on. And to give you one simple example, even in the Muslim history, throughout the Muslim history, the two main holy lands to the Muslims was Mecca and Medina. Mecca, where the Kaaba is, and Medina is where the Muhammad lived. And those were the main two holy lands at the times of the Muslims. Well, what happened is that there was a civil war about a century, within a century, a few decades after the death of Muhammad. There was a civil war amongst the Muslims. And one party took hold of Mecca and Medina and much of Arabia at the time, and another party took hold of the Levant, which includes Damascus and, of course, where Jerusalem is. And because at the time the Caliph who was in Damascus wanted to show, the importance and legitimacy of his caliphate, if you like, when compared to his enemy, who was at the time in Medina and was in hold of Mecca and Medina. So to many Muslims, the person who has Mecca and Medina must be, the legitimate one. But then the person in Damascus said, well, guess what? Well, I've got Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is holy. And this is how the politics of Jerusalem started, and in the Muslim tradition, and it had nothing to do with the Jews. It had to do, very much with a civil war between Muslims and Muslims.
Thank you. Gosh, how people and interpretation can make things very different, isn't it? To go back to this, and I think what we're drawing out here is this commonality is so powerful, isn't it? And that reading a text for what it says rather than what we want it to say. And that sort of brings me to this next question, which is that the Quran undoubtedly, as we know, is being used, even if it's only by others, as a way to legitimize various thinking. Have you seen, and you've traveled a lot recently, you've been looking at this very seriously, Rick. Have you seen anywhere where it is being taught in a more political or radical way, and any way that would, concern you?
Yeah. Well, I must admit that I get access to mostly to places which are not preaching hate and violence using the Qur'an. If they exist, I have not yet found them. I can see them on social media. I'm not sure if you call that teaching. But let me just tell you one thing which is which I found quite profound. A few weeks ago, I was in Cairo with my wife, and I went a few times to Al-Azhar Mosque. I had a friend there who's the head of education there, and we were sitting down in the cloisters chatting, and she said, there's a bit of time before the evening prayer, which you probably want to listen to. Should we go and listen? There's teaching all over the place in Al-Azhar Mosque. There's like class over there, women's class over there. And she said, should we just go into this class over here? And I said, sure. And there was a class, and there's the Imam sitting behind a desk, 20 people on the floor. We sat down quietly at the back. The class was in midstream, and he is reciting a verse of the Quran and then explaining it. And the verse was one about a battle that took place between Muhammad and his people and some Jewish people. And then he interpreted it. And the interpretation was so straight, if you like. There was absolutely no inference that there was to be some kind of continuing nastiness towards Jewish people. And even during that conversation, someone on my left said to the person who'd taken me in, is he a foreigner? She said, yes, he's from London. He said, is he Christian? She said, no, he's Jewish. And nothing happened. The lecture went on and so on. So just to explain that Al-Azhar, where we were, is the seat of Sunni Islamic teaching. I mean, everything goes out from there. All Sunni Imams have more or less been educated from that system. And I found absolutely no extremism in the teaching that I happened to encounter directly.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Abdullah, again, on the similar vein, I mean, obviously not the same experience, individual experiences, but can you shed any light on this for us as well?
Sure. And to be very honest, yes, I have seen how the Quran is sometimes misused for political ends, unfortunately. And it is not only, unfortunately, in the social media that we see it. We do. I have seen it in actuality being taught. This has changed quite dramatically, perhaps in more recent years than it was in the past, and it was highly motivated for political ends, really. And it's not something that we have seen about Muslim history, this kind of enmity existing, for example, before the 19th century. So it was only later on, that perhaps when certain political movements that have come from the 19th century and especially the 20th century with the formation of the State of Israel, that we did find some polemics misusing the Quran in order to show that. And of course, even in the very recent past, I mean, I don't know if I can even call it the recent past. Maybe it still is present. People like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, many of those terrorist organizations have unfortunately misused lots parts of the Quran in order to teach these kinds of enmities between Muslims and non-Muslims in general, when in fact it's not what the Quran really says.
Thank you. Again, it's back to this idea, isn't it? You have a text that is almost deliberately there to allow people to interpret it, but then people almost want to interpret it in a way that wasn't the guidance. It's interesting to unpick some of this. Again, back to some of your own work that you've been doing. You've been doing a lot of this as an interfaith exercise, which is really important. Are you able, do you think, to have a sense of how to put some of this important work into practice? I mean, is it possible? Have all these groups move too far away? Do they want to know that actually commonality is there?
That's very interesting because it's become very topical. And I'd like to thank Lord Wolf, who's here, because under the umbrella of the Wolf Institute, we've drawn together a tremendous group of academic professors to discuss just these subjects, and Dr. Ed Kessler's here as well. And it's been a tremendous forum, I think, to bring, first of all, the academic level professors to discuss the commonalities and differences in the scriptures. But if I may, I just want to show a few more slides about what we've been doing in practice, because earlier this year, we managed to organize, and I was quite involved in it, to take 6 imams, earlier last year, I should have said 2025, about a year ago, 6 imams and 6 rabbis, and we took them all in that castle and sort of locked them up for a few days together. And we put them not in the grandest room, but we went to a sort of meeting room, and we bunkered down in there for several days. And what was amazing was that there was no theological dispute between the imams and the rabbis at all through the whole of the 3 days. We just focused on agreeing an accord, which was eventually signed, about how to behave towards each other in the UK and how to avoid importing external conflict. And it was really a very successful session. There you can see on the right-hand side all strands of Judaism. Actually, not for the record, but most of the tension was between each side rather than between the Jews and the Muslims. And then on the left side, you've got a Barelvi, a Deobandi, a Shia Imam, a Sunni Imam, an Ismaili, and a Bahri. We had all strands of both religions sitting in a room, which eventually produced these accords. I took Spencer House and we signed these accords in Spencer House. And then you had this extraordinary sight of 6 imams and 6 rabbis walking across from Spencer House in St. James to Buckingham Palace, where they were received by His Majesty the King. I thought it was a tremendous achievement, but it's just the start of showing how religious leaders in both Judaism and in Islam can get on together. And if you ask me, could we implement that in practice? Well, we're starting. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we were invited to Eton, to the school, and I was invited to go there to give a talk a bit like this to the Jewish Society. And I said, I've got a better idea for you. How about we bring the Jewish boys and the Muslim boys as well and put them in the same room? And I'll bring an imam with me, and we'll see how that goes. And it went terrifically, and I took this picture. There's the imam sitting opposite me, Imam Razavi. And on the right is the head Muslim boy, and on the left is the head Jewish boy. And it was a tremendous evening of discussion and reflection that we had there.
Wonderful. When you could roll that out across schools across the country.
It should really in every school and every university, yes.
I'm just going to ask you a little bit. I am coming to you. Don't you worry. I do know you're there. But before I go any further, I open it up, I just want to sort of draw out a little bit about the personal, because I did allude to that in both your introductions. I mean, Abdulla, you're an incredible scholar. I just wish I could begin to understand how many languages you must speak and be able to quote extensively. But to both of you, you come from this different backgrounds. Rick, you started off in finance. I mean, how did you go about this research? Where was your interest in delving into this and making it really your main occupation intellectually, regardless of what else you've done?
I've been trying to work out my motivation because I've been very, very, very motivated this last decade. And backfilling to try and find the reason, I think it's probably this. I mean, I come from a family, and my wife does too, that were probably for 2,000 or 3,000 years somewhere in Arabia, probably in Baghdad, where we were most recently. And then it all came to an end. And our entire family and community and all the people around us, all Jewish people, left the Middle East. And there must be a reason. And my search has been, is any of the reason theological? Was any of this written in the book? And I think I'm coming to the answer that that was not the reason. And then how did I do the work? I lent very heavily, like I said, on the Wolf Institute, which has been tremendously helpful to me.
I mean, it's incredible to be balancing and these two things. I'm going to ask a similar question to you, Abdullah, because it's not necessarily always the straightforward path of somebody who's interested in Islamic scholarship. What's drawn you into this field of looking at the different sides, the different interpretations?
Well, basically, it's as I said earlier. I mean, to understand the Quran, there's no way to really understand the Quran if we don't understand its setting, its historical setting, and with whom the Quran was in conversation with, and what did the people whom the Quran was conversing with, what did they understand? How did they listen to the Quran and understood the message of the Quran? And the only way for me to do that, to do Islamic studies, is actually to really go back and see, well, what is the Quran referring to? Back to the Hebrew Bible, back to the rabbinic traditions, and see what it actually says and how the Quran is actually engaging with those traditions.
Thank you. I am now going to let you all join in, which is good of me, because I could carry on and do this for quite some time. I believe a microphone is coming down, and we'll start off with that lady over there, and then to the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you so much. I had the privilege of participating in a Bridging the Great Divide course with the Wolf Institute on Jewish-Muslim relations years ago, and it's great to be in person. I have a couple of questions. So one of my questions was about supersessionism, this idea that so I'm Anglican, full disclosure, but I'm an academic who looks at North African Jewish-Muslim interactions in literature from the 20th and 21st century. So I don't always bring my Anglican self as well as my academic self, but I'm doing that here. And I hear a lot of sermons, unfortunately, where it's basically preached that the Jews have been replaced by the church, or that Christ has fulfilled Judaism, or that Christ is the new Israel. And I was wondering if there's this kind of equivalent in some interpretations of the Quran that the Muslims have replaced the Jews and the Christians, or if there's a way of inclusion that that isn't necessarily universalist, because that's also a form of supersessionism, but if there's room for differentiation, basically, within the Quran. Sorry, it's a long question.
I think it's quite an important one, because we sort of touched on that a little bit. So perhaps we can actually delve into that a little bit more. This idea that you can have multiple faiths living communally together rather than replacing faiths.
All right.
And I think
I'm really in favor of one-word answers.
Go on.
So, Abdullah, is the Quran supersessionist or not? Yes or no?
Absolutely not.
Right. I'm with you.
That was a straightforward one, wasn't it? So theoretically, I think what we're trying to say is actually there's something to learn from all of them, and that they're all to add something. Gentleman in the middle.
Hi, Rick. Thank you. Abdullah, very, very insightful, I have to say. My question has to do more with what isn't mentioned in the Quran. And usually those answers are found in the Hadith, which are compilations of texts that were given, usually attributed to the Prophet, but were largely compiled 100, 200 years after his death. Many of these Hadith will often mention Jews in a very aggressive and confrontational and eliminationist manner. Chief among them, Sahih Muslim 2944, which advocates for the destruction of Jews, saying that the day of judgment will not come until they are destroyed. Even in the softest of interpretations, those kinds of, I would say, texts have become current in discourse, so much so that there are many Muslims who are under the false impression that these stem directly from the Quran. So, what do you wish the Quran said about Jews that it doesn't, which would help make Muslim communities more, I would say, impermeable to these extremist ideas and interpretations? Thank you.
Can I open that up a little bit to be less about what we wish it said, because it's not going back we're not going back 1400 years. Nobody's rewriting it, but maybe how those teachings of then should be acknowledged possibly and dealt with today. Maybe that's if I can open that up a bit more, would
That's
that
not
help?
really my question.
Yeah, I'm going to let Abdullah, you should answer it, but I'm also very conscious that there are things in the hadith, like the one that I was expecting to see in the Quran that didn't, that said there's stone, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. There are some nasty ones in the hadith. What do you make of those?
All right. So thank you very much for this question. Well, the Quran is actually very explicit. I mean, there's nothing else that the Quran could have said any further for people not to misconstrue it. I mean, the Quran is already very explicit that it does accept the Jews for who they are. It accepts the Torah. Like for example, where it says, the passage that Rick actually earlier had said, that we have revealed to you, the book Musaddiq, with confirming the book that is within your hands. ما بين يديه من الكتاب. So what is within your hands? So it's not some kind of hypothetical Torah that was long lost before the time of Muhammad, but during the time of Muhammad, that is between your hands, and is basically, muhaiminan alayh, which means trusting it. And then it says, and so judge between them with what God has revealed. And then later on, it immediately says, to each of you, we have ordained a law and a way of life. And if God has willed, he would have made you a single community. But his will is to test you with what he has given each of you. So compete with one another in doing good. To God will you all return, and then God will inform you of the truth regarding your differences. So the Quran is very explicit. It accepts the Jews for who they are. It accepts the Christians for who they are. And it's very pluralistic. So what would the Quran say any more than this? I think, it doesn't matter how much more that the Quran would say. You will always find people who would want to misinterpret, who would want to misconstrue for their own, perhaps, political gains, for their own polemics and things like that, which is very unfortunate. I'm sure that even whatever we say as individuals, we will find people who will even misconstrue whatever we say, and misinterpret us and misrepresent whatever we say. And there's nothing we could do unfortunately, to stop that.
So possibly what we should be saying is we want more people to actually read the book, read the Quran, read the Bible. Don't bother with the interpretations. They're from a period of history where people needed to be instructed rather than to read. And it's quite a powerful message, isn't it? Is to sort of ignore the scholarship and go straight directly to the word. I'll take a couple more questions. I'm also very conscious of time. I'm going to take a few more questions. The lady in the middle there, yes, next to the lady in the red jumper. Have you got the microphone there? And then we'll come down to the front where I can see.
Thank you very much. But I have one of the most controversial things to read to you, and I would like to hear your answer. The hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews. And the stone behind which a Jew will not be hiding will say, "Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." But and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it, because that hasn't been covered.
So again, that's the track that we've just been talking about from the Hadith, not from the Quran, is it?
But the Hadith is a holy...
That's correct. That's Rick. Perhaps you'd like to. This is the Hadith that you usually bring up, so
Yeah,
you may like to talk about it.
Hamas had to search really hard through the 10,000 hadith, and they eventually found this nasty comment. And they put it in their original charter, and they later, for political reasons, I think, took it out of the charter. It's not in the Quran, and the Quran is the primary book. You can't, in Islamic teaching, you cannot deviate from the Quran. And so I just think you have to take all those secondary sources, including the Hadith, in some kind of context to understand what was going on at the time. And there were conflicts at the time. I mean, there were tribal conflicts, there were conflicts between different people, there were conflicts between the unbelievers in Mecca and the people in Medina. There was a lot of stuff going on. And so I think you just have to take those kind of verses in context.
And it's that back to that idea is again, and I know with my students I say this quite regularly. It drives them slightly mad, which is that events don't happen in isolation. You know, there's always the meanwhile elsewhere element. So underlying something that you're looking at very singularly are a whole host of other events that are in fact influencing that one interpretation, that one decision, that one piece of writing. And as time moves on, people forget that breadth, don't they? And they focus on that one thing rather than the many. There's another question down the front there.
Hello. I don't know if it's working.
Can't see you.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Can we just...
Yes.
That would be very helpful, actually, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Let's come, then we'll come to you just one.
And
You could
thanks for
just wait
coming.
1 minute.
Can't
Thank
quite
you
see
for inviting.
Wait, if you could just wait 1 minute, it'll be yours in a minute. Carry on, please.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Rick. And it's very enlightening, this discussion, because this is the kind of Islam which I've learned over the past 26 years since I embraced Islam. One thing I did want to comment on, and why I interrupted there, sorry, bad adab, but it's relevant because it's on the track. And people are asking these questions about these hadiths. The hadiths about the Jews, that the end of time will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews, needs to be read in the context that the end of times will not come until the Muslims fight the Muslims. And the one who is killing won't know why he is killing, and the one who is being killed won't know why he's being killed. So I always read the hadith that the end of times will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews in the same context, bearing in mind that the Prophet Muhammad tried to, establish things in Medina, where he mentioned different Jewish tribes in his constitution of Medina, and says that you have your religion and we have our religion, but we are one ummah. He actually called the Muslims and the Jews one ummah. Now you've got these people, these extremists, and they talk about a Muslim ummah. No, that's not the ummah the Prophet was talking about. So these things do have to be contextualized. And as Rick said very accurately, the Qur'an is the preeminent text within Islam. So if anything contradicts the Qur'an, even a hadith, you can quite simply just put it aside, because if it's contradicting the Qur'an takes precedence. Hope that helps.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Very
Yeah,
helpful.
Yeah, very good.
I don't think this microphone is working.
It is
Is
working.
it? Okay. What a shame. I actually am the first time that I'm actually being exposed to hearing what the Quran says or doesn't say. I always believed there's one God and people should learn to live together, whether they're Christian, Muslims, or Jews. What my question, what I got out of tonight, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Quran seems to be sitting in judgment in a lot of the texts that we heard tonight from Abdullah, or that was saying, what right does it give the Quran to say that if the Jews are not actually fulfilling God's will the way they should, or that they're not being good Jews, and that they deserve this, or they have to pay the tax or whatever, they're actually putting themselves as judge and jury over the Torah, over Jews who are probably not fulfilling God's will, but they're putting us, it's like a sort of control thing, which I think a lot of religion is, and I'm a believer in God, believe me or not. But I believe even between our rabbis, there's so many trouble. There's not just between Christians. I mean, you know. So
I think we can say this, but what I will say as well is I would point out that in tonight's we've been addressing the Quran is a big book, and we've been very specifically addressing certain parts in order to open those up.
What was addressed tonight? So.
Yeah, but I think
But I think it's an important point. Go on.
Let me give a simple way of looking at this. Muhammad arrives in Medina. He starts finding that the people are backsliding. He thinks they're not obeying their own rules that are given to them.
Jesus said the same.
Well, and like you made the example that many rabbis come and they argue with each other. In a way, yes. Some say, well, these are the rules and you've got to stick to them very strictly, and other ones,
Well,
they turn a blind eye when their community
as
doesn't
they said
follow the rules.
in the play, you know, the rabbi said, "You're right, and you're right too," and and this is what we try and intellectualize and justify what is the Quran or this. The Torah teaches us a way of living, the Ten Commandments, which applies to Christians and Jews, and if you try and live by these 10 commandments alone, you'll be a very good person. So I don't understand how the Quran or Muhammad can judge the Jews, which, as you said, you only addressed the small. I can only go by what I heard tonight. Maybe I should learn more. But
Yeah, I think as what we're pointing out is that this is at the time there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is a historical period where maybe not everybody's not doing as they're told by the Ten Commandments, because, well, people are people. And not everybody does as they're told, do we? I mean,
but neither are the Muslims.
Thank you.
no, absolutely. I will round it up
There's one-
just with
one-
what I'm
one
going
or
to take
two.
one last question, and then I will
Take
tie it up.
a couple.
Are you happy? Are we happy to go over? That's fine then.
Actually, my question is connected to everything that was said here. Also, I am not so familiar with the Quran, more with the Bible. But from what I've seen today, it's never like saying our God. Okay, yes, he criticized the Jews, fine, but isn't it our God, the God of the Christian, the God of the Jews, the God of the Muslim? It feels here like there is a different God
Oh,
of
no,
the
no, no,
Muslim
no.
and a different...
Yeah, Varda, can I do it?
Yes,
Thanks
of
very
course.
much for the
just one
question.
more thing.
But
The
it-
second question.
Hang on.
No, no,
We just have
following.
one. You've got a second question. Good.
Yeah, well, following, I just want to mention another thing. If you could speak a little bit about who edited the Quran and where is the place of Ishmael versus Isaac in the eyes of the Muslim.
Okay. Is it the same God? Yes or no answer, Abdullah?
Absolutely.
Absolutely yes. It's the same God. El, Elohim, Eloah, Allah. It's even the same thing. There's nothing in the Quran which suggests that it's a different God. In fact, there's many statements which explain that it's really all pointing to the same God. No question about that. We did discuss a little bit Isaac and Ishmael already. It just came in Muslim interpretations later on, 700 years after the Quran emerged, that Ishmael became the dominant theme.
Well, I think one of the things that we want to, so that in the Abdul, have you anything to add? I mean, for me, listening to this evening, what I've understood from that story is that you're taking the story of one book and referring to it and drawing it out further for people centuries later. These are the stories, these are the threads that connect all the faiths. I mean, you go through all the people of the book, and you will find these stories contextualized for the audience they think they're talking with and to. We've got one over there, and I think that's probably it. And then I have a couple of final ones, obviously.
Okay.
Hi. Is this working? Oh,
yes, it is.
Thank you for a wonderful event. I just wanted to ask a question, but I also wanted to just make a comment to the lovely lady in the front. Just give my 2 cents. You.
That would be you.
lady.
That would be you.
I just wanted to say that obviously the Quran came last in the string of things, and I feel like it's human nature to comment on what other people do and give our 2 cents in what other people do. And had the Torah come last, I feel like we would probably have been critiquing the Quran and the Bible ourselves also, but that's just my 2 cents. This may be a moot point. I just wanted to ask you both, is the issue with the Bani Qurayda and Khaybar, is that in the Quran? Yes or no?
Abdullah, did you catch that?
If you mean the chant on the street, which is what I think you mean.
No, the Battle of Khaybar.
Yeah,
and
there's a chant on the street. Khaybar, Khaybar, ya Yahud,
no,
Khaybar.
sorry, just the slaughter of the Bani Qurayda, is that in the Quran?
The army of Muhammad is coming to get you, is returning to get you again. They're referring to a battle in Khaybar.
Yeah, so
is not, the Quran's not a history book. So I would say the answer is basically no, that there's no
Yes,
account of a battle in Khaybar in the Quran at all.
Oh,
no,
it's not there at all.
Khaybar
Okay.
is not mentioned in the Quran.
Okay, and the killing of the Bani Qurayza is not there?
Nope.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
the interpretations will give you some of their interpretations, but nothing of that sort in the Quran itself explicitly in
Okay.
words.
Brilliant. Okay, that's very interesting. I only wanted to ask because in Muslim circles, when I'm with Muslim friends, they often bring up the killing of the Bani Qurayza. And I was thinking that the Quran it's a lot of it, all of these books are about interpretation. And how do you tell people to interpret certain texts one way and then get them to interpret other texts another way? It requires a lot of dedication to the literature itself. It requires a lot of being able to imply and infer. And that's very, very difficult. And I think it also makes it clear as to why a lot of these things get misinterpreted, because you really you had to color code everything to make us understand
Maybe
what was
in
going
the
on.
next talk, it's not quite our field, but what we should have is a list on the screen of all the tropes that are used by people who think they're using the Quran to incite violence.
I've got another idea. I think we come back in a few months. I'll get you back. I'll have a word. We'll get you back. And we pull out some of this and we look again at how some of those tropes and how they've been used and how history can help us contextualize some of that. Would that work for people? Because I think people could do with a bit of as a historian, you could do with some proper history as well as some proper knowledge of the religious text. Yes? We'll see. I can't promise everything, not in one night. I am now, though, however, going to begin to round up. Now, I didn't give you a long list of achievements, Abdullah, because, that we only had so much time. And I do know that both of you are now working on a book together. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And then I can urge people to understand more as I invite you both back in the future. Tell us about the book.
Do you want to go, Abdullah?
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay. So Abdullah and I have written a book, actually, which is in production, and
Even
all
better.
being well, Be'ezrat Hashem, inshallah, in the fourth quarter this year, we'll be back here for a book launch. And the book, what is the book? Thank you. And the book, which is truly a joint production between Abdullah and I, has taken this subject in a way that's never been done before. It says, in the Torah, there's 54 parashiot, 54 weekly portions. We read one a week, basically. And all the rabbis' commentaries are on the weekly portion. Well, we've asked, and this book goes into 54 chapters, what would the Quran have to say about each of those 54 chapters? It's never been done before. We're very excited about it. And it's a proper academic book. There's going to be Arabic writing and Hebrew writing and lots of quotes and everything. And it's been really one of the pleasures and privileges of my life, Abdullah, really, to work with you on this book. I mean, in the process, we've been speaking multiple times a day, most of the time for the last few years, communicating with each other. It's been a tremendous privilege for me. And we've become kind of companions and friends in the process. So have our wives, I think. So it's really been one of the greatest things I feel I've done in my life so far.
Well, the privilege is really mine, and thank you, because it was really your initiative. You actually thought of actually making this book and working together on it. And I think it's very timely. I think we do need it now, very much so. I mean, it's a very unfortunate times that we're living in, but it is perhaps the time that we not just seeing all of the negativity, but also at least we're hoping that the book will provide a path for maybe some kind of reconciliation between the communities of both faiths.
I mean, it sounds I also particularly like the idea that I can take it week by week.
Right.
And maybe establish a long way of learning. It's been wonderful having you both here this evening. I for one, have learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else here has. It's to be given an insight into something that we think we know something about. It turns out we know very little, by people who know an awful lot. I think is incredibly powerful. I'm not going to quote from the book because, well, that would be foolish of me. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. But I am going to quote somebody else who said something just as important and more of a humanist, but it applies to, I think, particularly what you are doing. And that is from a different scholar from a different age who said, you know, all it takes for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. Well, I'm delighted that in the room tonight we have good men who are doing very much something, and maybe then evil will not get to prevail. So thank you both.
Paula.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for being here.
To all of you, thank you for being with us this evening. And well, I look forward to welcoming you back to JW3 and ideally to see us all again.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks very much. Paula. Very good.